Hi everybody, Academic Leftist here, and today I wanted to talk about Biden's student loan forgiveness of up to $10,000 to $20,000 of student loans for individuals making below $125,000 or families making below $250,000. Again, if you like this content, please remember to like, subscribe, and comment below. Okay, so Biden had actually initially vowed to eliminate or largely reduce student loans during the election campaign, largely probably because he was up against somebody like Bernie Sanders in the primary debates and in the primary elections. Now, what happened was, of course, once he became the nomination, the Democratic corporate base wasn't exactly in favor of the elimination of student debts. And they had a number of concerns about eliminating student debt, and Biden reversed his position on eliminating student loans completely, but now he's actually reached a middle ground and decided to compromise with some of the Democratic base. It has angered the corporate base, but it very well could guarantee his re-election in 2024 or the election of some other Democrat in 2024. Now, what I wanted to talk about today is the main criticism coming from not just conservative quarters, but from mainstream quarters as well, mainstream media quarters like CNN, about the problems with student loan debt and student debt elimination. And that has to do with whether or not it's going to reverse some of the gains put forward in the anti-inflationary bill, which Biden has also put into effect, and whether or not the elimination of student debt in general can be counted on to increase inflationary tendencies. This is a topic I've touched on in my previous video when I looked at some of the main drivers of inflation, and so this is a timely issue as well. Now, the argument coming from the critics of student loan cancellation, or the very narrow and limited elimination of student debt, and keep in mind this was a means-tested trial program for the elimination of student debt. It's not going to affect everybody, but the main criticism coming from mainstream and conservative quarters regarding this decision by the Biden administration is that the money that's now going to be put back in the pockets of former students and the individuals who owe these sums will now go towards fueling the economy and generally contribute to upward inflationary pressure in prices. So, how credible is this claim that the elimination of a portion of student debt will drive inflationary tendencies and pressures in the overall US economy? Well, here it's actually valuable to revisit a controversy that took place in the 1970s and the 1980s, and this was known as the Laffer curve, named after the supply-side economist Arthur Laffer, who was very influential when it came to the Reagan administration's tax cuts in the 1980s, the income tax cuts. What Laffer argued was that cutting personal income taxes on individuals, both wealthy and middle class, and cutting business and corporate taxes would actually have the effect of dampening inflation. And recall that this was taking place during a period of stagflation in the 1970s and 1980s. So the argument put forward by Laffer here, which was also supported by Republican congressmen such as Jack Kemp, and eventually was a huge influence in terms of the Reagan administration's decision to cut taxes, was that when more money is actually put back into the pockets of individuals and businesses, and when the tax rates themselves are cut, what this will mean is that individuals will have an incentive to work longer hours because they will actually be taxed less on their income. Their marginal tax rate will decrease. Furthermore, he argued that the added demand that would be generated as a result of putting revenues and taxes back into the pockets of individuals would spur the economy. This would spur investment. This would spur a greater supply of goods and services. And not only would the additional goods and services then bring down inflation, but the added economic activity would add to absolute tax revenues, even though the tax rates, the marginal tax rates, were being cut. And so this is what influenced partially the Reagan administration's decision to cut taxes. This idea that the increased stimulus from additional buying power and spending by corporations and individuals, as well as the incentive for individuals to work longer hours because of the fact that they'd be now taxed at a lower rate on each additional increment of revenue. Well, this essentially was something that was going to reduce inflation according to its proponents. Now, as other heterodox economists like Paul Sweezy and others have pointed out, supply-side economics is flawed for a number of reasons. But in this case, it's flawed because there is no guarantee that the additional income generated from cutting tax rates will necessarily go towards purchasing additional goods and services, especially when we're talking about business and corporate taxes. Furthermore, in an environment where there's increased competition from foreign producers and where a number of producers in the United States were being squeezed as a result of this competition, there's no guarantee that the additional buying power, even if it is spent on goods and services, will lead to additional investment and hence an increase in supply, but it very well could simply lead to certain firms raising the prices on their goods, and that would actually exacerbate the inflationary tendencies in the economy. But the important point to keep in mind here has to really do with the hypocrisy, and that's why I wanted to mention this history of the Laffer curve. The same conservatives and mainstream pundits and mainstream news establishments that at the time were praising this idea of the Laffer curve and the idea of tax cuts, and who continue to praise the idea of tax cuts to this day as a mechanism for reducing inflation, are now making the argument that the additional income that will go into the pockets of individuals through student loan forgiveness will have the impact of increasing inflationary pressures, when if we look at the rationale of the Laffer curve, there's no reason to believe that it will have any effect that's different from the tax cuts. Moreover, I should also point out that there are a number of ways in which this could, of course, spur or stimulate the economy, especially when it's going to individuals who make below $125,000 a year. And this has to do with the marginal propensity to consume. Keynes pointed out long ago in his general theory that individuals who are not wealthy, so non-wealthy households or individuals who actually are within the bracket of working class or middle class or really consumers, have a higher propensity to consume than the wealthy households and the wealthy capitalist classes who have a higher propensity to save. So by putting this additional income into the pockets of those individuals through the student loan forgiveness, it very well could have the impact of stimulating the economy, especially in this type of an environment where, because of COVID-19, the economy is still facing the repercussion of things like layoffs and reduced spending power, etc. And the second thing I wanted to point out, and this goes back to my other video that I made on the issue of inflation, is that the entire critique of student loan forgiveness and the idea that it will cancel out the anti-inflationary program of Biden is built on this assumption that inflation currently is being driven by monetary policies and additional spending power and too much money circulating into the economy, when in fact there's very good reason to believe that this has to do with supply side shocks and problems along the supply chain caused by COVID, which is also being exacerbated by monopoly pricing power by certain corporations in the United States and abroad that are taking advantage of the supply problems by using their market power to raise the markup on prices and to actually increase and boost their profits. So once again, there is no evidence that this current bout of inflation is being primarily driven by monetary policies and by monetary issues. So that essentially summarizes how I think people should view the student loan forgiveness issue and how it ties into this problem of inflation, and how we should actually really just dismiss this idea put forward by conservative pundits and commentators and the mainstream press to some extent that student loan forgiveness is going to actually harm the economy or generate increased inflation. There's really no evidence in my view to support that position, or if there is, it's very minimal evidence.